Very welcome, everyone. So for another episode of FSR Insights within the FSR online event series. And in this one, we always invite academics, one to present the research, and then a few others to discuss. And we are always Lucilla and I. Today, Lucilla is just exiting another conference, so she has been doing enough moderation today. She told me, this time you can go first, you can do the intro, you can do the moderation, and I'll take care of the questions. So Lucilla is expecting questions. So for everyone here, please do add some questions to our chat or Q&A box, and we'll take them towards the end of the event. And the event, of course, starts with James. James is one of the researchers in our gas decarbonization team. He has been doing a lot of interesting work, and today here he will present one of his most recent work, a policy paper that was linked to on the website, the event page, and he's been discussing how we will import hydrogen. And then mainly pipeline versus ships. So we know from natural gas that we do both. Question is, for hydrogen or other clean molecules, will we do the same? Or does it not make sense? And should we focus on one or the other? And what will determine that choice? Then, as you have noticed on the webpage, James didn't want to make it too easy on himself. So he really designed a discussion with three discussants. We have Timo, we have Alejandro, and we have Sarah connecting. And the webpage says that they will provide different perspectives: engineering, policy, political science, and economics. And so then this morning I was screening their profile thinking who is who in this story, but they're all a bit mixed, I would say. So for instance, Alejandro has two affiliations, but he has been doing some engineering, some economics. He's currently in policy. He also recently already presented a study in one of our other events. So if you want to know the details of that study, he did a really nice study on the future of green hydrogen in the EU. Then I screened Timo this morning as well, and he did, for instance, a really nice study on how to decarbonize industry. And of course, hydrogen will play a role in that. So I'm sure he will have a very complementary perspective, also coming from engineering, but also having some management background. And then we have Sarah. Sarah's profile is in energy system modeling, with also somewhat chemical engineering background, but also clearly close to more economical questions. So she's working on sustainable gas, and I guess hydrogen includes her analysis. So I think with these three, we will definitely have an interesting discussion. James, you now have the floor. You will just present your paper, and then we'll kick off the discussion. Go ahead.
Okay, super. Thanks very much, Leo. Much appreciated. Also to my co-discussants for joining. Please go easy on me, but indeed, yes, hopefully we can have a really nice discussion as well for everyone for joining today. I hope the paper is interesting and that I can share some insights and we can have a good discussion. So let me just kick off by sharing the screen so you can get a look. Hopefully you can see that. Just minimize this box here.
Yeah, we can. James, go ahead.
All right, perfect. Then let me start. So yes, as Leo said, it's a recent policy paper that I worked on together with Andrew Spiebags, who's a part-time professor here at FSR. And indeed, it looks at the different ways that we might look to import hydrogen into the EU. So let me just first give a little bit of background on that, why this choice and how we went about thinking how we might go about answering these questions. So firstly, the EU is targeting 20 million tons of clean hydrogen by 2030. We know this from our review, but those of us who have spent time going through these numbers perhaps see more realistic projections at around 12 million tons or perhaps even less. The vision is to have a roughly 50-50 split in terms of domestic production versus imports. So our paper looks at the import side. So let's say roughly 6 million tons by 2030 that might come in from outside the European Union. We have to be prescient of the fact that these are essentially completely new value chains, given that existing hydrogen demand, although it's maybe 8 million tons in Europe, something like that. It's basically all of fossil origin based on reformed natural gas. So the clean hydrogen that comes in will be corresponding to totally new value chains. So how do we go about building out those in a sort of efficient way, getting ahead of the game, given that this has not really started in any meaningful scale yet? And finally, just to be clear, it's not an assessment of whether or not it's wise to import this amount of hydrogen, or how we might go about making that sort of rationalization based on final demand. We've tried to take a number that's a bit of a compromise and just say, look, if you're going to do it, how would we go about doing that most sensibly? What is the view of the European Commission in this? Like a bit of context to see the difference in vision. Well, you can see from this chart, which is based on a presentation from the Hydrogen Bank, that there's roughly a 50-50 split seen between ships and pipeline, right? So you can see 4 million tons of demand of shipments by 2030 in the form of ship deliveries, and the remaining roughly 6 coming from pipelines. So it's close to a 50-50 split, with the earliest volumes coming in via ship. And really, like, it's a bit of a spoiler, let's say, but this kind of vision doesn't really follow the conclusions from our paper, from our analysis. So it's maybe a bit of a pause for thought and reconceptualizing how we look at these different value chains. So hopefully that gives a bit of context. Some of the guiding questions that we tried to look at were, okay, so we have this global natural gas trade and a relatively even split across the two. So how does this stack up for hydrogen under different conditions with a different molecule? And often hydrogen is framed as a direct replacement for natural gas. So let's just, be careful about the language we use and the ways that we might envisage hydrogen being used or its derivatives in a way that's different to natural gas. Ultimately, how does this correspond to this sort of high-level infrastructure planning that's required in order to maximize efficiency and avoid redundancy? So we're looking at the overlap in the usefulness of different pieces of infrastructure across different carriers, for example, and how we might go about avoiding redundancy. A third guiding question that's important is how Europe might go about leveraging its competitive advantages and make use of constraints in other regions. So what sort of Europe's position in the global context here, being prescient of the fact that there are different markets all around the world that are emerging for shipment of this energy vector. Ultimately, can we match our infrastructure development with the market growth? So 2030 demand is important, but what about 2040 and 2050? Can we build infrastructure that scales to those needs? Or maybe an additional scaling will not be necessary if demand doesn't go far in excess of what's envisaged over the next decade. So these are all sort of big blue sky thinking questions, which are just sort of a nice intellectual challenge, as well as being important from a planning perspective. And then hopefully this brings us ultimately to some kind of a semblance of whether ships and pipelines are an either or choice. Can we see them as two sides of the same coin, or are really they very different in their characteristics, and how we might go about planning? So first on the scale, and let's go. So in this first part of the presentation, I wanted to communicate that as a point of departure, we looked at, okay, well, how much is likely to be imported and according to what timeline? And this will have implications for the kind of infrastructure you want to build, and also the end product. So hydrogen, but also the derivatives. So keeping in mind that hydrogen is the basis for producing important derivative products like ammonia, synthetic fuels, methanol, etc. So looking at in the context of its other value chains. As I said before, there are 20 million ton ambitions in the REPowerEU, but we use this excellent study from JRC, which takes sort of literature review of different analyses from different parts. And it basically, you can see on the right, on the upper graph, how they are anticipating demand from different sources. And the range is pretty significant. Below is the global range, which is arguably even bigger. If you look at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, for example, in their numbers versus what, for example, the IEA would say or Shell are saying. So you can see that there's a huge range of unknown in the final demand, and therefore perhaps a risk of overbuilding as well. You can also see that there are several other scenarios not accounted for in this analysis that consider there to be less than 5 million tons of likely demand in Europe by 2030. So just to give a bit of context, there's this huge range of uncertainty, but roughly we can say 12 million tons 2030, 26 in 2040, and 40 million tons in 2050. What about derivatives? Well, you can see that, as I said, there's hydrogen as a standalone product, but there's also hydrogen in terms of the contributions it makes to the markets of other derivative vectors. So ammonia, we anticipate to stay relatively flat in terms of demand, but it's a really significant market. It's roughly 18 million tons at the moment. Methanol demand anticipated to grow from 10 to 18, and e-fuels is a huge question mark depending on whether or not it's adopted as a viable fuel in road transport. But just from the mandatory targets in shipping and in aviation, you could imagine that there will be a really significant demand for this product. But again, there's a large range of uncertainty, but anything up to perhaps 10 million tons by 2040 is possible. So let's look at first the sort of strengths and limitations as far as we saw it of the different infrastructure. So once you have your overall numbers, how do different infrastructure stack up in terms of their usefulness for moving these products? For this, we have a few guiding questions. So when would you even import, and how this will contextualize things like the geography of supply and demand, being prescient of the fact that Europe is energy poor, and therefore in terms of renewable electrons, and then how to maximize the utility of the imports and where the biggest trade-offs are. So we consider these three questions. Yes, that Europe is likely to be scarce in renewable electrons until at least 2040, that the delta in levelized cost of electricity between supply location and demand location should be more than 20 euros per megawatt hour, roughly speaking, in order to justify an import. So where that gap is below, perhaps it's not needed. And then finally, let's keep in mind that the size of the internationally traded hydrogen market is likely to be much smaller than other international energy markets, both in terms of overall volumes and demand. Also, because of the properties of the products, it's likely to be traded more locally than the oil and gas industry. So it's, again, just trying to check our sort of thinking when we're making direct comparisons with energy value chains that we're comfortable with already. So the first question is arguably, okay, well, what's the cheapest single ton? And there's been lots of really good analytics done on this, on what could potentially deliver the single cheapest ton of hydrogen. This one from Van der Meulen et al. From last year is really nice because it gives the same delivery routes. So from energy products leaving this range of countries that you see on the right, Argentina, Australia, Canada, etc., being delivered to a final destination in Europe. So it's a consistent chain, and then using different means in order to get it there. And you see you've got everything from hydrogen in the form of ammonia to liquefied LOHC, methanol, and then different ranges for pipelines, as well as locally sourced natural gas-based blue hydrogen and green hydrogen as well. The main is for 2030, and the lower range is 20%. So this gives you some impression of where you see the most aggressive cost improvements to come, which would be in chain 2, for example. Here in the second chain for liquid hydrogen, you see that the range bars are quite big. That's because they anticipate quite fast learning relative to, for example, this in ammonia, where it's more known as a shipping method and it's not likely to drop quite so quickly. These are also the high and low scenarios for shipping via pipeline. So you can see that basically there's no overwhelmingly obvious winner in terms of shipped carriers, which are these first 4 chains. But probably you would say that ammonia looks the most competitive, particularly in the short term, and liquid hydrogen shows the best opportunities for price drop over time. And rather it's pipelines that give perhaps the most attractive financial conditions, looking at chain 5, for example, for those pipelines where it's well suited, let's say. But the point I would say most important here is just to say that there's no clear overwhelming winner in terms of what could deliver the cheapest single ton. But the earliest projects are typically coming out for ammonia shipping. Let's see. Struggling to move forward here. There we go. Okay, so how do ships and pipelines compare in terms of their properties? The first, we'll start with shipping. So ultimately, one of the obvious strengths is that you can have this flexibility in suppliers. So this is really good for security and competitiveness. We've seen this, for example, on the natural gas side, a big movement towards LNG deliveries because they help give this this flexibility that you can't with pipelines. The EU has expressed some interest in establishing the European Union as a spot trading market for hydrogen in the EU, with the euro as a reference currency. Shipping is much more dynamic for establishing something like that. As I said, ports are an easy place to make fast industrial innovation. So for this early uptake could be useful, and there's a low marginal cost for increased distance of deliveries. So whether you want to ship from South America or you want to ship from North Africa, there's not a huge marginal cost for that additional distance traveled. So again, it's really good for flexibility. There are issues with the complexity of the value chain. So you're talking about packaging a hydrogen into a carrier, cooling it, etc., putting it on the ship, transporting it, maybe with different fuels for propelling the ship to the carrier on board, unpacking it, the other side, often very energy intensive to get it into the final product that you want. So this complexity is going to engender complication in scaling. As I said, there's a lack of clarity in the optimal carrier. So is there an opportunity cost in terms of technology picking there? And these both create issues for scaling and capacity building. The number of steps, the complexity in the value chains creates these sort of compounding technology and skills barriers. So even though you may have a high technology readiness level for example, the tank, if you don't have it for the compression or the cooling equipment, for example, or for the crackers on the other side, then you have these sort of compounding technological problems which can slow the build out. A low compatibility with existing infrastructure refers to the compatibility between LNG ports that exist and the usefulness for imports of clean molecules, which besides methane-based ones is very, very poor. Typically less than 50% of the cost can be carried over. But the most important weakness here, I would say, is that these hydrogen carriers are typically only 5 to 18% hydrogen. So if it's hydrogen that you're after, they have a very low overall hydrogen content, which means you need massive volumes and massive scale. On the pipeline side, you can deliver massive volumes. We know that. It's an established practice in the hydrogen sector. That's how hydrogen is moved now. There's several thousand kilometers of hydrogen pipeline now. So there is that, and it's a simple value chain that's well understood. It can make use of existing infrastructure where repurposing is possible. I've noted here trade incentive between connected parties. So for example, if you were to go into building a connection with a third country, you would by far be the cheapest delivery point for that provider because of the transport costs once that infrastructure is established. But it does rely on a certain amount of realpolitik approach to your planning and your choice of energy delivery. On the weaknesses side, it does have a very high capex and risk of over centralization, which I guess you could lump together. So you're really investing in a few core pieces of infrastructure that are therefore, yes, high level of investment and potentially tie you to a given supplier. So it's a potential for a security risk. And again, you need very large volumes in order to make it that project cost effective, as well as just a function in order to properly pressurize the pipeline, for example. And yes, on the same side, like with regards to your connections with other trading parties, you limit yourself by the range within which it's feasible to draw those pipelines. This, I will just go quickly on this, but it gives you an indication of the scale issue. You have here some maps from NSOG on the H2 infrastructure planning maps. And on the left, you have the total import capacity for terminals and port projects for 2030. And the total capacity is less than 1 million tons. Whereas for the pipeline transmission, it's roughly 30 million tons. So the calculations I did for this are a little bit crude, but the point is just to indicate scale. And these are the projects on the ground. So, the projects in planning. So you see this in the context of the EU's 4 million tons of imports by 2030. And you see the tension there between, let's say, political ambition and what we're seeing in terms of viable projects. So ultimately, what are the sort of key findings and implications that we try and draw from this? Well, in short, there are a few points we'd like to make. So firstly, that shipped hydrogen carriers, as I said, they only cover this sort of 5 to 18% hydrogen quantity, which means you need a massive amount of scale in order to to get the kind of volumes that you would require. There's a big energy penalty for carriers in the importing region. So when we go back to that original point that one of Europe's big aims here is to try and overcome this being in an energy deficit, having a scarcity of renewable electrons, the heat required for unpacking these carriers and getting them back into hydrogen or cracking them into something else is massive. And you're placing that penalty on the importing region. So something like liquid hydrogen, which has a huge energy penalty in terms of cooling it down to minus 253 to get it into liquid form, is hugely energy intensive, but at least it's in the exporting region. So we're keeping a consistent narrative there and a consistent planning in terms of trying to export our energy deficit, let's say. And then thirdly, this is perhaps the most compelling single piece of data or single conclusion, which is that just as a thought experiment, I think this came from the IEA or IRENA, that if you repurpose the entire global LNG fleet, so 572 vessels to liquid hydrogen, they would deliver just 6.5 million tons of hydrogen per year. So this is with 100% hydrogen capacity, 100% hydrogen as a proportion of the ship delivery. The technology is not there to do it, and it's the entire LNG fleet, so it's completely blue sky thinking. But that would cover the, let's say, projected EU import needs for 2030. So as you can see, it just doesn't scale. And in that sense, it's not an ideological position to say that the pipelines are needed to meet these kind of levels. It's just a reflection of the technical capacity. And although you could have a conversation about the single cheapest ton, the overall picture is really very clear, I think. So where now? Well, we have a few very quick conclusions, which are essentially, whilst you're going to have these kind of corresponding hydrogen value chains, I don't know if it's totally clear from this slide here, you're best served keeping those vectors as they originally were and minimizing the conversions between them, because you have big losses. So let's not be importing methanol to convert it into renewable hydrogen, for example. Let's use it as methanol. There's a big established market there, and it can help decarbonize it. Likewise with ammonia, for example. And similarly, if we have domestically produced renewable hydrogen and imported ammonia, let's not be converting our domestic renewable hydrogen to ammonia and our imported ammonia to renewable hydrogen. Keep the vectors in the form that they are, and see the value in decarbonizing those markets. Secondly, there are arguably two stakeholders that must commit to shipping hydrogen and its derivatives. These are exporting islands and remote locations and importing islands and remote locations. You might think of Australia or South Korea, Japan, Chile, South Africa, a few examples. And ultimately, the EU does not fall into these categories. So if you imagine that these are the technologies that are going to drop in cost most quickly and where a clearer winner is likely to emerge, in terms of whether it's going to be LOHC or it's going to be ammonia, methanol, liquefied hydrogen, etc., the EU doesn't necessarily need to be the one to pay those upfront costs to scale those technologies. Perhaps the EU could jump into that market to diversify once a clearer winner has emerged. So this graph illustrates that quite nicely. You see how big the range bars are, for example, for liquid hydrogen, and how much these are dropping over the next 20 years. Well, Europe doesn't need to pay those early costs for scaling and maturing those technologies when there are other players in the global market that do. And then finally, we just wanted to recontextualize and say, coming back to that original point about the parallels that can be drawn with natural gas, how far they are instructive and how far they are not. Let's just be, let's just think about the overall numbers and the fact that 12 million tons of hydrogen would mean about 296 terawatt hours of energy, so roughly 2% of primary energy demand. And if only half of that is imported, does it really constitute a security of supply concern that justifies a big focus on a kind of flexible infrastructure that debates that security of supply issue? I would argue probably not. So maybe when those volumes increase, it makes more sense to push to diversify. Okay, so I think I've gone even a little bit over time, so apologies for that, but hopefully it's all clear and we can get into a bit of a discussion. And yeah, thanks again for the time to present.
Thank you, James. Really nice presentation. So just a reminder to everyone, don't be shy in putting your questions in the Q&A box. Lucilla will try to keep track of them. But we have 3 discussants, so I'm sure they can also keep us busy until the end. So we have 2 scenarios here. And I suggest that we take them one at a time, that maybe if they have more than one question, they take turns in asking a question or making a comment on what James just presented. So just looking at the 3 of you, someone really eager to start. Hi, Sarah, by the way. Thanks for sneaking in just on time.
Hello. Yeah, sorry. I had some issues of the connection. Well, I can start with a few.
Yeah,
with
please. Thank you.
Some comments. First of all, well, thank you for inviting me to join, this panel of experts. First of all, I really enjoyed the reading of the paper, and as my background is primarily really on supply chains and energy systems modeling, especially focusing on novel supply chains. I really enjoy particularly the contents of the paper, specifically on the aspect of this feasibility of the scale up of the supply chain for hydrogen specifically. So and I would agree on this concept on the importance for the supply chains to look at the supply chain overall for working on a novel energy system where hydrogen would play like a much bigger role compared to now. So this means that obviously transport, when it is envisaged as a way to connect really the places where there's a high abundance of a source, as opposed to places where there are large consumption, the supply chain plays a critical role, and we have seen it how it needs to be built not only with the purpose of reducing the costs of the supply, but also to enable like affordability for our energy, but also to make our system so more resilient and more reliable. And specifically focusing what we saw some examples during with the current energy crisis, not only, but even earlier during the pandemic, that we saw these issues connected to a limited number of suppliers for certain resources. And these are all situations where we can create a not very reliable supply chain that can break very easily. So I think overall that showing these constraints regarding the scale up of the transport option for hydrogen, this basically brings to light, this clear need of having a wider portfolio of options that both locally and internationally can help build the supply of hydrogen for Europe. So I should say this is like in the long term should be something that should be seen more in the strategies for realizing the hydrogen supply chain. And the other point also I would like to stress is about this two-step approach that was envisaged in James' study. So the fact that you can have like first mover, and this can be like a demonstrator of a technology, and that is an important aspect for creating novel infrastructure. Some other examples where we really need, for example, examples of like successful cases are also CCS and other biofuel supply chains, where there are there's a need for investors and for the society to see like successful cases also coming and being realized and deployed. And that overall, well, as a final comment, just the last one, I also think that, we think this perspective of building, of having like a clearer like limits on the actual capacity for the trade to basically bring to supply hydrogen. This will enable realizing like a more secure supply chain in the future, and we have to see how the different options for reaching the net zero targets then will interplay. So we see. So I don't think we should see like the constraints on the trade as something that should discourage us towards reaching the targets, but something that should like enable us towards considering the wider options and the synergies between the different options to reach the net zero targets. So the different renewable options and also energy efficiency. And with this, broadly, these are broader comments that I had were like sort of raised during my reading. And yeah, so I'm happy to join the rest of the conversation as well. And if there are more comments from others. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And I realize I still have to do some academic name dropping. So I already celebrated your research in my intro, but I should still say that Sarah is affiliated with Politecnico Milano and Imperial, Alejandro with ETH Zurich and Harvard, and Timo with the IIT Comillas in Madrid. So some nice academic panel here. Do we go around, James, and then I allow you to react first? Okay, Alejandro, what are your first comments?
Hi, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure. It's a pleasure always to be at the Foreign School of Regulation. So I think it's a very timely and relevant paper. So congratulations on having it out. I digested it and I have two takeaways from it. Which I don't know if you would agree or not, and I agree with both of them. The first one is a call for caution in what the role of hydrogen imports will be, especially in the short term. This is one takeaway message that I got from the paper. I think you show this very clearly throughout the paper that maybe the expectations for how large hydrogen imports will be in 2030 in particular might be a bit bigger than what will eventually turn out to be. And I think this, with something that I don't agree quite so much, that I think that reinforces this point, or this takeaway message, is this point that you mentioned, that the scarcity of renewable energy in the EU. On a EU level, maybe I would agree, but I think there are very different cases within the EU, right? And we are starting to see a lot of negative prices of electricity some days in some countries, and in particular in the south, in Spain and Portugal, which I'm more familiar with. This scarcity argument, I'm not sure it holds water. And with the regulation that is coming, especially with the additionality requirement, this scarcity argument, I think it still holds some weight, because we have to demonstrate that we can build all the renewables we want to build at the speed that we want to build them. But I'm not sure I fully buy it. But this reinforces, again, this caution on the role of imports and what role imports could play, or we want them to play. And the second takeaway that I think it's also very important is this idea of sequencing, not having to do everything at once, and trying to figure out what things can be done first and what things later. And in particular, the way I understood your argument, it's a call to prioritize maybe pipelines in the shorter term, because they're more viable, there is more expertise, they have larger potential, etc. And maybe consider shipping to play a larger role in a later stage. And I think these two takeaway messages are important, and I hope people read the paper and they agree maybe with my takeaways, because I think that could be useful for policy making on hydrogen. These are my two takeaways. I have also two questions or small challenges. So maybe I'll throw one, and then I'll save the second one if we have time. So some time ago, with my colleague from Harvard, Nicola de Blasio, we wrote this opinion article calling for a coordinated approach towards building the hydrogen economy in the European Union. And unfortunately, I don't think we've succeeded that much. And I wanted to ask how you see the role of coordination playing out in these pipelines versus shipping. Because in my view, one of the main difficulties for pipelines is that you need to get a lot of countries to agree on building this infrastructure. And we have very painful lessons from Spain in trying to connect our energy infrastructure to the rest of Europe through the Pyrenees. So we know it's difficult to build this kind of infrastructure. While for shipping, at least at this stage, when you can write a memorandum of understanding relatively quickly, it's much easier to do bilateral agreements, where it's just one country agreeing with another, and then you might be able to get the ball rolling much faster. So I wanted to know if you have any thoughts on what role this difficulty or easiness for coordination could play in pipelines versus shipping. Thanks.
Thank you, Alejandro. Good points. Let's just quickly let Timo in, and then we go back to James for a reaction.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed reading it. I actually got stuck with your policy recommendations because they really made me think. But before I go into detail, I actually want to mention a very small point on what Alejandro said, because it's almost like a paradox as it sounds, because pipelines are normally quite difficult to construct because you have to have so many stakeholders agreeing. You have not in my backyard problem. No one wants to have a pipeline, and the ship is actually a quick and easy solution. I just ask a shipyard to make one, and then it's there. So you really see a paradox that you say the pipeline is actually the quicker solution than the ship to a certain degree, but that's only to the side. Now about the policy recommendation, because as Leonardo said, my main area of interest is industrial decarbonization, and that's where all the hydrogen demand is sitting, or most of the hydrogen demand, especially in the short medium term. And your recommendation of saying, okay, let's import molecules that contain hydrogen and work with these molecules made me think, because we're producing ammonia in Europe right now. We're producing methanol in Europe. And when you're saying that we're supposed to import it and use it, it means that actually our European production of methanol and ammonia might not play a role anymore, because we have imports which, under that assumption, are cheaper than producing and using this in Europe. And that's something that also doesn't really, like, for me, collides a little bit of what we see with industrial development in Europe, where especially in Spain and Sweden, you have massive projects pushing for ammonia production in Europe. Because also in the European context, this is one of the cheapest industrial applications that we have producing ammonia. But it also made me think towards the idea of importing, let's say, hydrogen by, let's say, via the product, because in the end, ammonia is a product that contains hydrogen, that's NH3. But there are many other industrial products that when we talk about decarbonization options, especially the steel sector, we all have hydrogen as a feedstock in the production process. And also steel today is a globally traded commodity that is very easily and cheaply shipped. So if we take that thought further and say, okay, we import ammonia and methanol because it's much cheaper than producing it here, we can actually extend that to all other kinds of basic material and basically say we're closing energy-intensive industry, and our entire hydrogen imports are not direct imports, but they're basically via products being produced somewhere where hydrogen is very cheaply produced. So I would be very curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Just a few easy questions, James, to start with.
Yes, no, I did. Thank you so much for all your reflections and yeah, for taking the time to read the paper, to listen to the presentation and give your insights. Really, it's a pleasure for me and a privilege. So really, thank you so much for that. Even if they are difficult, but I'll do my best not to embarrass myself in response. Let's see. Well, I would say maybe a good starting point, because it cuts across a few of the questions that came up, is to return to, let's say, the limitations or the basic assumption of the paper, which is, if you're going to do this, how would you do it? So rather than, trying to say, would it be smarter just to import the steel or just import the finished fertilizers and such, which I agree is a very legitimate question, and you could very well write a super long and detailed paper and a very complex analysis of this, and most likely you would find the smartest thing to do from a purely energy economics and financial perspective, and also ease in terms of value chains. As you say, steel ships very easily, fertilizer ships much easier than ammonia or hydrogen, would be to export those energy intensive industries to where the cheap energy is and import the finished products. But the paper tries to just say, okay, you have this level of anticipated demand, which is somewhere in this range. If you're going to service it, how would you service it? And we try and sort of limit it a little bit so as not to go totally down this rabbit hole, which I think, this rabbit hole should be pursued because there are lots of interesting questions down there to be answered. But yeah, we just try and limit it. And I would say the point that, yeah, both you and Alejandro raised about the difference between the overall European problem about being energy poor in terms of renewable electrons and what's going on at a member state level or a regional level is a really interesting nuance to that, definitely. And I would say, because of that statistic that's mentioned in the presentation about the 20 euro per megawatt hour delta in LCOE, that's an important point to come back to here when we're going through the thought process about when we would import and why. Is where that delta is less, there would still be a very attractive case for producing these products in Europe, and that would be and that's likely to be pursued on considerable scale. I think it's probably a case of where it can't be, where capacity is still limited to an extent, then the imports will have to service it. And let's not forget, yes, I agree with what you say, Timo, about the risk of losing let's say, the ammonia sector to imported ammonia, but the existing ammonia sector is totally fossil based. So if we're going to try and decarbonize that, and that push is going to come from the ETS price or from cheaper alternatives, cleaner, greener alternatives coming from abroad, as well as perhaps a little bit of geographical relocation within Europe, like Fertiberia, for example, are moving quick on this to become very competitive. Though that sort of relocation is already happening. But if you're going to import the ammonia, keep it as ammonia and not transform it into other things, because otherwise the cost of the final products in Europe are going to be even higher. And let's, as I say, acknowledge that we're drawing up new value chains for these products anyway. A fossil ammonia industry has a lifespan, a life expectancy in Europe, let's say. And it's good that we're innovating in the places in Europe where we have abundant energy in order to service it and keep it within the continent. But where there's going to be extra, and you see, for example, in the ports of Antwerp, Bruges, they're already expanding their capacity to import more ammonia. This trend is happening, but let's, not incentivize, let's say, quote unquote, the wrong projects that would then crack it back into something else that would then, let's say, multiply the losses and the wastage there. But yeah, this nuance about what's going on inside Europe, I think, is really, really interesting. So thank you for that. Yeah, finished products, infrastructure, on the sequencing of technology and planning that Alejandro brought up, and what's the role of coordination and shipping and bilateral agreements. Yeah, I agree. This is really the difference also mentioned by Timo, like the tension between the difficult parts and the easy parts of making the agreement. And maybe it's easier to draw up an MOU or to commission the building of a ship than it is to do the agreements across several member states to get a pipeline approved. But where you have, for example, these technology stacking issues, you might be able to build the ship, but if you can't build the other corresponding parts of the value chain that are needed to pack and unpack and handle the product, it's sort of this technological stacking problem that it might not be an administrative issue or a planning issue, but it might be a pure technology issue, and it might be a pure scale issue. So you might be able to do it in the case for shipments that will take you to a certain level of imports, but that ceiling is not very high. And I think that's sort of what the paper tries to tackle, is like the difference between getting the cheapest single ton and getting building out a full scale industry, right? But it does say a lot that the first projects that are coming online at the moment are mostly direct bilateral agreements, often even between ports, not even countries, but between ports and a supplier in North Africa, for example, or elsewhere to deliver ammonia. It says a lot. So I do agree with your point. It's more just that I think the ceiling for scaling that kind of approach is limited, and it won't fulfill the needs for a full-blown hydrogen economy, let's say. At least it doesn't feel like it. Sarah mentioned this interesting point, which is about the risk of being binded to a given supplier or a number of suppliers, and the pipeline definitely does have this risk. And I guess, yeah, on that, I would come back to our third conclusion, which is that in how Andres and I tried to look at this problem, the security problem, we sort of said, well, we can understand the issue. It does make sense that this diversity problem is a big challenge, and it is a big concern of European consumers at the moment, and it's very politically sensitive. But does the total energetic volume of what we're talking about, the total energetic quantity, justify, you know, a huge potential overbuild or huge potential risks in building out this infrastructure in order to have diversity? When you're talking about maybe 1% of final energy demand in 2030, does that represent an acute security of supply risk? Are there ways that you could even buffer that if needs be, maybe with existing SMRs and things in the worst case scenario to deliver that hydrogen if it became, you know, would it even have geopolitical power, let's say, that, you know, if it was limited to a couple of suppliers on a few pipeline routes? And I'm perfectly willing to be challenged on that. Maybe we were, you know, maybe our final decision that at the moment in 2030, it doesn't seem like a security of supply risk to us, but maybe in 2050, when the technology learning curves, for example, for liquefied hydrogen have become much more attractive and competitive, then we could look to diversify as it constitutes a bigger share of our overall demand. That was sort of our conclusion, but perhaps it's the wrong one, you know. Perfectly happy to be challenged on that. Sarah also mentioned this issue about first mover advantage, which I think is interesting. Also on technology innovation, Europe's done a really good job in the past of being on intellectual property and being at the forefront of research and innovation, and hydrogen is another potential opportunity for that. And maybe there's something in the IP and the scaling of and the innovation in the technology that could remain within the European ecosystem and the European economy, but this investment in scaling the technology at an industrial level, based on the analysis that we did, it feels to me like that would be better left to other players around the world that have a vested interest, but don't have the same, let's say, like infrastructural advantages that we have in shipping. Yes, apologies if I missed anything, but those were the ones that I've got listed down.
Thanks, James. I think now we have some activity in the chat box, so I'll hand over to Lucilla. And of course, the panelists can still also interact on these comments raised by the audience. Go ahead, Lucilla.
Thank you, Leo. Thank you, James, for the nice presentation, also for the panelists for the very punctual and not easy to answer questions. Indeed, I agree with you, Leo. And we have now a couple of questions from the audience, so let's address them. Which I have to tell you, it's not easy in the same level from our panelists. But let's start from the first one, Frederic Rosier. So Frederic is asking you a very interesting question about how your analysis incorporated the role of storage in hydrogen. So how the both technologies, or either shipping or pipelines, comparable in terms of most cost-effective efficiency in terms of storage integration? I think it's an interesting question. What do you think, Leo? Do you think I should address more questions, perhaps
I would just take all of them, and then maybe some can be answered by James, some by the other panelists. It's
Yeah.
easiest.
Yeah, fantastic. Then you have Oliver de Block, who is asking as well an interesting question related to the value for exporting countries to export refined product to create more value for their own economies. So it's an interesting question. And the third one is not precisely, is more related to renewables. So Felix Betty, it's asking you, how expensive and feasible is the construction of additional renewables and energy infrastructure in potential exporting countries, no, which have not been energy exporters and thus do not have a big energy supply. So you have three questions on the table, one related to storage, another one related to renewables to produce the hydrogen in itself, and it's to you to answer, James.
Okay, super. And thank you very much for the questions. Yes, on storage, I can be really fast. We didn't include it in the scope of the paper. It is an interesting point. I'm far from expert on it, so maybe that's a good one also for our panelists to take if they have something to say on it. I would say generally from what I know about it, the integration through pipelines would potentially be easier because you might make easier use of the compatibility between existing natural gas storage in gaseous form than storage of the derivative form. So I know, for example, one of the technological limitations in the liquid hydrogen value chain is the size of the tanks. They're not big enough to carry a huge amount of energy, to store a huge amount of energy still. Ammonia has this horribly poisonous corrosive properties, which makes it dangerous to store in large volumes and close to centers of population, etc. So if you're moving gaseous hydrogen, it does leak. It is a small molecule, but it has compatibility with, for example, salt caverns. Everyone talks about geological storage, which has pretty reasonable marginal costs. So I would imagine it would integrate best with pipeline deliveries like that, because it's just in its gaseous form. But as I say, not an expert, and definitely an interesting follow-up subject. On the export of finished products from other countries versus exporting energy products, I agree. Andres and I also wrote a paper on green hydrogen exports from Africa, and the interest in renewable hydrogen and exporting the derivatives or finished products. And this was one of our conclusions, that if it's to be done on, let's say, like a level playing field between European and African partners in this example, then one of the mistakes that has been made in the previous export of commodities relationship with Africa, for example, we use the trade in chocolate, is it would be wise to ensure that there's a complex economy left in the exporting region. So, developing green steel industry, chemicals industries, fertilizer export industries, because it's a more robust economic proposition and it synchronizes well with our existing technologies for transmission. So from a personal perspective, I agree. I think that would be a much more compelling offer for these exporting regions. It would just be a case of capacity and interests from the importer point and from the exporting capacity perspective. But it's outside the scope of the paper, really. Maybe I leave it there and not pass on to the panelists.
Yep, I think perhaps we could move for the panelists if they would like to address any of the three questions from the point of view. Timo?
Yeah, I could quickly comment on the storage part, because it's something that is not mentioned very often, but I think it's a key aspect that everyone that talks about hydrogen storage should understand. That just by the physics of it, we always need 3 times more space to store the same amount of energy compared to natural gas. So when we talk about salt cavern storage, when we talk about liquefied hydrogen by ship compared to natural gas by ship, liquefied natural gas, we always talk about a factor 3. And the same is basically factored inside the entire hydrogen value chain. We talk about pipeline, or if we talk about ship transport. The only interesting part maybe to take into account for pipelines is the reason why in pipelines we actually expect to have a comparable capacity is because the molecules of hydrogen are smaller, so they can move faster, they cause less turbulences inside the pipes, so we can actually transport with the existing pipelines a comparable energetic volume of natural gas and hydrogen. But if we say, okay, we store, then again, hydrogen pipelines, because we also use pipelines to a certain degree as a storage buffer, that potential again drops to 1/3 compared to natural gas pipelines.
Farad and Alejandro, you would have would like to comment any of the questions from the perspective of your own research?
Well, I can so I can comment to this question around the feasibility of investments in countries where there was no, like, countries that are not exported. So I would say that this is already sort of partly touched in the conversation and during the presentation, and so the feasibility would come from how easy it will be to attract investments for creating the export infrastructure, and that is very linked with the possibility of creating these agreements between exporting and importing regions. So there isn't really definitely one single answer about how easy that would be, but it certainly would become like feasible in presence of certain type of commercial agreements on the matter of the exporting hydrogen.
Alejandro?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on this because part of my second comment was related to this, and is one of the main advantages that, James, you mentioned about shipping is the flexibility in suppliers. But this has a hidden assumption, which is that you will have suppliers to choose from. Now, for them to invest in developing the infrastructure and the production of clean hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, whatever, they need to be relatively sure that there will be a market for this. So I think here it's a little bit tricky how to play with the expectations. And I mean, this is a debate between friends, and we can be a little bit more broad brush. But I think when it comes to policy communication, even if you're not going to prioritize shipping, you still need to make sure that you will be able to enter the game later, right? So I think like this, let's all innovate and get out of it, and we'll focus on something else, could come back to haunt us as the European Union. Because we might be, the markets will develop then in the direction that other players would want to, and the technologies. And this might not always be aligned with the interests of the EU. And this is why I think maybe more nuanced or careful prioritization between shipping and pipelines is important, because otherwise these advantages of shipping, like flexibility of suppliers, might not be there. If these countries think, well, this market is not going to be open for business, then we will not do these investments, we'll do some others. And I think this will be important to finally realize if this feasibility of these countries, and I'm mainly thinking, for example, in the north of Africa, eventually become large exporters of renewable energy vectors or hydrogen or whatever. So I think it's an important question. It deserves a little bit more nuance on the policy side.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I think thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Sara, and thank you, team, for your time to come and speak with us. Thank you, James, for your presentation. We are precisely on time. And I think the lesson from all the debate is the complexity, of course, of doing research and what including in your research. Like your research did very well analysis on cost-effective analysis. The policy goes to another level of discussion in terms of could you collaborate or not collaborate it? How is the willingness of the countries to sign the agreements to have in the pipelines? And this is another level of discussion, which is which is also interesting to bring to our next step. So thank you so much for attending and listen us, and just keep following your FSR Insights.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye bye.